Imagine escaping the devastation of war, carrying with you nothing but the dream of safety. That was the reality for one Ukrainian refugee who thought he had found refuge in Europe. But instead of security, his journey ended in tragedy on an ordinary train ride. This story is about the violence that claimed his life, the failures that allowed it to happen, and the haunting questions it leaves behind. The victim was among the millions who fled Ukraine after the Russian invasion in 2022. He was in his early 30s, someone who had left behind family, friends, and a homeland torn apart by bombs and destruction. For months, he had been adjusting to a foreign culture, battling the loneliness of displacement, and trying to rebuild a life from scratch. To him, the train that evening was just another step toward normality. He was traveling, like thousands of others, believing he was in a place where he was finally safe. But safety was an illusion. The train carriage, filled with commuters, workers, and students, became the scene of horror. Witnesses later recounted how quickly it happened. The attacker, armed with a knife, rose from his seat. Within seconds, the refugee was targeted, struck multiple times before anyone could understand what was happening. The confined carriage trapped passengers in chaos. Screams echoed, bodies pushed against each other, some trying to escape down the narrow aisles, others frozen by shock. What followed revealed the cracks in a system meant to protect lives. In theory, European trains are equipped with cameras, emergency alarms, and communication channels. But in practice, many of these measures failed. On this train, there was no dedicated security presence. Surveillance cameras, placed years earlier, were outdated and unable to cover the carriage fully. The emergency button was pressed repeatedly, but it took long minutes before authorities could intervene. Those minutes were the difference between life and death. Passengers tried to act. One man attempted to restrain the attacker but was forced back. Others tried to shield children who were crying in terror. A woman later described pressing her hands against the refugee's wounds, desperately trying to stop the bleeding as others shouted for help. But despite their bravery, the refugee succumbed before paramedics arrived. He had escaped missiles and bombings, only to die in an environment where he believed he was safe. The attacker was eventually subdued and arrested. Yet, questions remained. How could someone bring a weapon on board undetected? Why were passengers left vulnerable in a sealed carriage without immediate protection? Why did emergency response take so long? The government's response followed a familiar script. Officials expressed condolences. Railway companies promised to review procedures. Police pledged thorough investigations. But for many, these words rang hollow. This was not the first time violence had erupted in public transport, and each witness testimony shed more light. One passenger, interviewed days later, said, "The scariest part was how helpless we were. We pressed the alarms, but no one came. We were trapped inside with a killer." Another added, "If there had been even one security guard on that train, maybe this man would still be alive." Their voices echo the fear felt not just in that moment, but in the days afterward, as ordinary people realized how vulnerable they were in everyday spaces. Media coverage amplified the outrage. Headlines screamed about the stabbing, images of police outside the train station flooded screens, and commentators demanded answers. Social media erupted with grief and fury. Some users shared stories of their own fears traveling on public transport, others focused on the injustice that a refugee fleeing war should die this way. Yet, alongside sympathy came darker currents, voices that twisted the tragedy to stoke anti-refugee sentiment, despite the refugee being the victim. This division reveals another uncomfortable truth: tragedies like these do not occur in a vacuum. They become battlegrounds in larger debates about immigration, security, and social cohesion. Some argue for tighter borders, ignoring the reality that the refugee was not the threat but the target. Others call for more robust safety infrastructure, questioning why governments invest in technology and military spending while neglecting the everyday security of their people. Looking at the structural failures, three stand out. First, the absence of visible security. Unlike airports, where armed personnel and scanners dominate, trains often rely on trust and minimal checks. This leaves them vulnerable to anyone determined to smuggle weapons aboard. Second, outdated technology. Cameras and alarms cannot replace trained human presence. When those systems fail, passengers are left unprotected. Third, reactive governance. Safety measures are introduced only after tragedies, rather than proactively preventing them. For the Ukrainian refugee, these failures cost him his life. But the implications go far beyond one man. They force societies to ask whether they are truly prepared to safeguard not only their citizens but also those who come seeking shelter. Refugees face double jeopardy. They escape violence at home only to encounter hostility and neglect abroad. Studies have shown higher risks of assault, exploitation, and mental health crises among displaced populations. Stories like this stabbing reinforce the cycle of fear and trauma. Instead of finding peace, refugees live with the constant reminder that danger follows them. The tragedy also raises questions about compassion. A man who had lost his home, his safety, and his country sought nothing more than survival. His death on a train was not just an act of violence, it was a failure of humanity. It exposed the indifference of systems that claim to protect but fall short when tested. What should change? Experts argue for longer routes, especially during evening hours. Modern scanning technology must be installed at major stations, not just for terrorism prevention but for everyday safety. Emergency response teams must be trained to react faster and more efficiently. And most importantly, refugee protection must extend beyond paperwork, it must mean real safety in real spaces. The attack sparked debates in Parliament, with lawmakers clashing over solutions. Some pushed for stricter policing of trains, while others warned against turning public spaces into militarized zones. Yet, for ordinary passengers, the answer was simple: they wanted to feel safe. Safety should not be a privilege or a luxury, it should be a guarantee. As the weeks passed, the victim's name risked fading from headlines. The world moved on, as it always does. But for his family, the pain remained raw. For his fellow refugees, the message was terrifying: even here, in the heart of Europe, danger is never far away. In the end, this story is about more than one man. It is about the silent failures that claim lives every day, unnoticed until they explode into tragedy. It is about the illusion of safety in societies that prioritize convenience over protection. And it is about the need to recognize that refugees, who have already lost so much, deserve not only our sympathy but our action. The Ukrainian refugee boarded that train with hope. Hope that he was moving forward, that his journey of survival was not in vain. Instead, his life was cut short by violence that could have been prevented. His story must not be forgotten. It must serve as a reminder that true safety requires vigilance, compassion, and responsibility from all of us. Because if a man can survive war but not a train ride, then we have failed not only him but ourselves.